I was saying to somebody just now that doing 2 lectures in succession is a painful test of intelligibility and all the rest of it. You suddenly see how many people have decided they've got better things to do with their time. But thank you for those who've come back. In the second lecture, I want to think aloud a little bit further about those critiques of solidarity that I've already mentioned. In the first lecture, I noted that solidarity is to be distinguished from those 3 things: communitarianism, common good thinking, and empathy. And so let's look in a little bit more detail at those criticisms and where they come from, because very often when solidarity is spoken of, it is spoken of in terms which can shrink the dimensions of what its full capacity really amounts to. I tried to hint in the first lecture that a language of solidarity that is worth pursuing theologically is one that looks to that long-term, radical, universal solidarity expressed in the idea of the body of Christ, that is, the human community reconstituted in full mutuality. Every participant characterized by need, radical vulnerability, every participant characterized by gift, the possibility of sharing life with the neighbor. So, what's wrong with these 3 variants? Beginning with the communitarian style. If solidarity amounts to fundamentally a communitarian ideal and no more, the question immediately arises, which community? And once you ask which community, you are also committed to questions about which other community you are not in solidarity with. I mentioned before the break Józef Tischner's 1980 sermon in Poland, where he spoke about solidarity without enemies as the ideal which he wanted to propose in the context of the Polish political upheavals of that generation. And the concern there is always about a solidarity which reinforces mutuality, corporate value, deriving one's own value from the wider order, which speaks of that in terms which can be exclusive of the class, linguistic, racial, religious other. And that's obviously an issue, and we see it, practically speaking, in all kinds of settings. In the history of the politics of Scandinavia in the last century or so, there's been a very strong emphasis on folk identity, on a society deeply mutually supportive, characterized by what seem to some people in the United Kingdom radical welfarist policies, minimal social inequality, and all sorts of things which make many of us feel it would have been quite nice to have been born in Finland, given the chance. The shadow of this has appeared more recently as ethnic diversity has increased because of migration and refugee presence in Scandinavian countries, and the resurgence of a racist far right in Denmark, particularly in recent years, but also in Sweden, has been one of those things which have been somewhat shocking to the admirers of Scandinavian polities, and yet seem to be very much built in as the shadow side of a particular valuation of community and solidarity. Here we are as Danes, Swedes, or Finns, supporting one another with profound generosity, with an acceptance of an ideal of social equality, or at least minimized inequality. And that balance is drastically upset by the arrival of ethnic and religious strangers, with whom there is no common history to ground that sense of folk identity and the mutuality and mutual support that goes with it. Closer to home, of course, many of us will be familiar with the similar ambivalence in historic working class communities in this country. Ken Leech, once again, in several of his books, The Sky is Red, again is a case in point. Ken Leech speaks about what he calls the normative view of sameness, which can prevail in some such communities. The profound value that many have found rightly in traditional British working class communities has at times the shadow side of that normative view of sameness, the suspicion of the exceptional, the suspicion of dissent, the suspicion of innovation. And certainly British communitarianism of this kind also has a somewhat indifferent record, to put it mildly, on gender issues. Because of the normative view of sameness, it can be taken for granted that there is a natural way of social belonging, and it's us. At its worst, that sense of corporate identity, that sense of a solidarity dependent on sameness, is very readily weaponized against external threats. And I don't have to rehearse the way in which the debate about the Brexit issue mobilized such anxieties, and the continuing debates about migration trade on that strand in the communitarian ideal. So we need to be cautious about supposing that the communitarian package is an answer to the question that is identical with an ideal or an imperative of solidarity, largely because of that central role played in this by some identifiable form of sameness, a shared history, a shared language, a shared ethnicity, whatever exactly ethnicity means. And it really is high time in our public debate that somebody pointed out that ethnicity is a word about as graspable as jelly in this context. But again, another course of lectures there, not to be delivered by me, and not this morning. Where solidarity depends on sameness, we're talking not about recognizing strangers, but on recognizing ourselves. We're not talking about a labor of recognition. And it seems to me that in much of the language about solidarity I sketched in the first lecture, it's taken for granted that solidarity is something which is appropriately labored at. It is something to do with work. And I'll return a bit later to the importance of work in this connection, of something fascinatingly flagged quite independently by Bonhoeffer and by Josef Tischner. But a togetherness, a solidarity which has no element of work about it, in which recognition is always obvious. Well, you don't have to have worked all your way through Hegel's phenomenology of spirit to understand that there's something slightly pre-critical or pre-reflective about that model of community or togetherness. What about the common good? It's a concept which is not without its uses, to say the least. And we certainly see that in a social environment where the notion of common good appears to be almost evacuated in the imagination of some of those who I suppose we still have to call politicians in this country, being polite. Common good, in the sense, as I said earlier, that there are goods which are inconceivable unless shared. Inconceivable unless shared. Common good is one of those things which, in the proper sense, disciplines the aspiration of the individual or the subgroup by insisting that what is for their benefit, for their flourishing, is literally unthinkable without the benefit of the other. And in terms of our global situation, the notion of a global common good, which we are a bit slower in working out, is increasingly bound up with any intelligent response to our environmental crisis. There are not, in fact, large barriers saying no admittance around our borders when the insurgents, the incomers, are rising tides or rising temperatures. And ultimately, our good is bound up together. However, crucial as that is to any sane social philosophy, the point's been made, and I turn yet again to Ken Leech as an eloquent critic here, the point's been made that if our language about the common good fails to take seriously here and now actual conflicts of interest, actual collisions between the good of diverse groups in terms of race or class or gender, then to speak of the common good can look like, and often can be, an attempt at what I earlier described as a premature resolution, again of the labour, the difficulty of actual social life. And this is, I suppose, the great critique that might be offered of what comes from Durkheim's notion of solidarity as cohesion. To say, if you're an industrial manager to an industrial worker, we live in a solidarity of work because I can't do what I do unless you do what you do, and you can't do what you do unless I do what I do, is fair enough until you begin to think of the imbalance of power and the level of control and identification of the other involved in that power relationship. To put it slightly differently, we may talk about shared need and shared gift, but what about the situation where the need encountered by one is almost immeasurably greater than the need experienced by the other? If we're talking about a common exposure to a difficult and challenging and work-inducing environment, what do we say when one segment of society is manifestly more exposed, more naked to the elements than the other? So the language of common good can, in old-fashioned Marxist critique, lend itself to the mythology of pre-established harmonies which are reflected in social relationships here and now, in a way that discourages us from understanding that there are real conflicts. Once again, the good news for the poor is not that the rich feel awful, and similarly, the good news about the common good is not that the industrialist and the industrial worker are bound in a common enterprise, but that that common enterprise is so structured that the exposure to risk and need and vulnerability of one is not vastly disproportionate to the risk, need, and vulnerability of the other. Similarly, and here I address some of my own rhetoric on this point, similarly, to speak of shared vulnerability and to speak of the need for the dispossession of the ego is fine if the person you are talking to is the person who is in possession of certain forms of control and social definition. But, as is often said, to recommend the dispossession of the ego, with nothing else said, to those already dispossessed by the agency of others is clearly a moral outrage regularly perpetrated by men upon women, by majorities upon minorities, including sexual minorities, by race upon race, by white upon black, etc. So beware of the premature consummation of language about common good. There is real diversity of interest, there is real diversity of identity, and if there is diversity of interest, then what I call the radical shared interest that characterizes solidarity in classic socialist rhetoric is going to be something abstract and fictional. Once again, language about the common good can be, if we're not looking carefully, can be static, It can tacitly assume that we, that mysterious we, who write books, who draw up plans and dictate policies, we actually know what is good for all before we start. So the question left on the table by common good language is, defined by whom exactly? Known to one party in advance or discovered in the complex labor of negotiation and interaction? Work, once again. And what about empathy? Let me quote again from Pope John Paul II. Solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, that is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. That is, again, from Solicitudo Rei Socialis. And while the language of the common good is used there, I want to concentrate mostly on that first phrase, not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress. Empathy is now a remarkably popular concept, in case you hadn't noticed. We're repeatedly told that it's something which we ought to be teaching, as if it could be taught. We're told by some who probably ought to know better that all problems are really soluble through empathy. There is even a book, I'm sorry to say, called Adventures in Empathy, which rather suggests that it's an agreeable leisure activity. And if I may quote, this is almost a chance encounter recently with Slavoj Žižek's latest book, Christian Atheism, How to be a Real Materialist. Žižek, with his trademark acidity, talks about a recent set of disasters in 2023 in Slovenia, hit by floods and landslides, with thousands of homes destroyed and whole towns cut off. The reaction was an unexpected show of solidarity. Although this show of solidarity was sincere, Žižek goes on, it was not yet what will be needed in the catastrophes that await us. For the large majority in Slovenia, life went on as normal, and the display of solidarity just allowed us to feel good without in any way changing our way of life. Allowed us to feel good without in any way changing our way of life. The display of solidarity, he concludes, was thus the expression of a desperate wish not to confront the depth of our crisis. I think the key word there is the display of solidarity, performative solidarity, which we're, I think, very familiar with indeed in various forms of rather unreflective political action. There's nothing especially wrong with demonstrating in solidarity with X or Y. There's a good deal wrong with the way in which that simply feeds a sense of one's own righteousness. And performative solidarity is, I think, one of the most problematic elements in our public life. I'm certainly not one of those who wants to repress performative solidarity, but I would like to interrogate it a little bit harder at times. The idea that solidarity is primarily, for some almost exclusively, that sense of being deeply stirred by the suffering of another, that relates to the myth of empathy as a kind of access to the interiority of the other, which allows me to feel in resonance. And somehow that feeling in resonance is itself a good. But when we think harder about empathy, things become a great deal more complicated. Empathy can be deeply individualized. It can be self-regarding. It can be, tacitly or not so tacitly, a matter of absorbing the experience of the other into mine, so that rather than understanding the strangeness, the impenetrability of the suffering of the other, I imagine that I can actually enter it, contain it, and work with it. The characteristic, "oh, I know," of solidarity in this sense needs to be replaced by "I have no idea." And to make a point frequently made in pastoral education, there are significant moments alongside those in suffering when "I have no idea what you are enduring" is the only morally and spiritually appropriate response. At worst, empathy can indeed be a kind of dissolution of the other in a contemplation of one's own profound sensitivity. I understand exactly how you're feeling. And that colonization, I use the word advisedly, that colonization of the other's experience becomes something which simply, as Zizek says, reinforces my righteousness, my comfort, and ultimately my refusal to address the depth of a real crisis. The need, the pain, the exposure, the vulnerability of the other is indeed, in a very important sense, which I'll come back to, like mine. At the same time, to see it for what it is requires the willingness to understand how it is not like mine. And our moral education is less, I would say, an education in empathy, as sometimes conceived, as an education in bafflement at the impenetrability of the other's suffering, which cannot be reduced to my categories and my words. It's where Bonhoeffer's helpless solidarity actually has something rather important to say to us. And the dangers there of, again, the premature utterance of the ultimate categories into such a situation. If indeed there is shared interest between us as human beings, then standing alongside in solidarity is a crucial element in our virtue. And yet, a standing alongside, let alone a speaking for, which assumes that I continue to dictate the terms of the engagement, is less than what is really demanded here. Empathy, in short, is not enough. And as we have certainly learned in the past few years in thinking particularly about racial questions, the would-be ally has to be challenged and changed and enabled to move beyond fellow feeling, supposedly, to a standing with, which is genuinely a form of common labor. And that, once more, I think is something of what Bonhoeffer is steering us towards in his reflections in the Ethics. So those are the three kinds of critique of solidarity language which seem to come up most frequently in the literature. And all of them have considerable weight. And the weight, as I've indicated, has something to do with the way in which each of them, in their different way, moves away from or around that issue of common work. This is where I go back for a moment to Josef Tischner, and not only his sermon of 1980, but some of his essays in the 1980s on solidarity. Not only does he say we're looking for a solidarity without enemies, he speaks of a solidarity expressed typically, paradigmatically, in common work. And a common work which is grounded, he says rather interestingly, in the service of life. He speaks of work itself, and it's a memorable phrase, work itself as conversation in the service of life. Conversation in the service of life. odd at first sight to describe work as conversation. But when you think about what conversation might entail here, you can see that in a conversation, two speakers, fully aware of their difference, within an equal speech situation, are creating an outcome which will genuinely be theirs, not just mine or hers or his, an outcome which depends entirely on the negotiation of free and open speech, an outcome which has consequences beyond the relation just of the two. It's an extended metaphor, but it's one I find very interesting in this particular connection. A conversation in the service of life. And that willingness to converse in the service of life is, for Tishner, in the sermon and in his later writings, something to do with a sense of an awakened conscience and consciousness. The words are closer in English than in Polish, but Tishner uses both in his writings. He says that people have a hunger for conscience. They actually want to be drawn into an active sense of a responsibility for the life of all that they can exercise. They want to become workers. And part of Tishner's originality is to link that deep impulse in us wanting to be workers with the reality of conscience. Conscience, he says, is the awareness of the pain of the other, the awareness of the vulnerability of the other, and the awareness that I, as conscious of that, am immediately both summoned and empowered to act in the light of that perception. So work becomes intrinsic to a full and robust and sustainable sense of solidarity. The virtue of solidarity is not a feeling of compassion. The virtue of solidarity is not simply a standing alongside in itself, though that is implied in it. The virtue of solidarity is exercised in the discovery of shared labor. The shared labor that over time, often painfully and often inconclusively, the shared labor that seeks to discover what it is that identifies for us a common interest genuinely and honestly capable of being owned by all those involved. Not a situation where a prevailing power is able to tell itself, or we are able to tell ourselves, that we are virtuous because we are simply aware of the other in our terms. Not a situation where we are sentimentally disposed to think that we understand the interiority of another and are so absolved from labor, but that practical involvement, or to use a favorite word of Gillian Rose, investment of ourselves in the discovery of interest that is neither mine, ours, nor yours, theirs. Now that idea that there is indeed ultimately a common interest to be identified for human beings as such is by no means self-evident. And an easy, a glib rhetoric of human dignity or human rights, about which more later in this course of lectures, can mislead us by supposing that everybody really understands the values of solidarity, the imperatives of human rights. And it's only because of millennia of superstition and falsity that people fail to see how obvious all this is. I think the story is almost the other way around, but there'll be more of that to come next week. But if that identification of common interest for human beings as such, that identification of common interest beyond tribalism, beyond the divisions we're familiar with, if that is indeed the basis on which work can and should develop, we are manifestly in need of some, I'll use the word again, myth of shared human vocation, which will allow this to make sense. And here again, I go back to Anna Rowlands' title, Towards a Politics of Communion. When Christian theology talks about communion in the body of Christ, it begins, certainly in the way St. Paul handles it, in 1 Corinthians particularly, it begins in the recognition of existing tension, existing conflict. It's fair to say that we wouldn't have the New Testament at all if the early Christians hadn't argued with one another almost as vitriolically as we do these days. The New Testament has its roots in conflict, an uncomfortable recognition. But St. Paul did not simply write Christmas cards to the Corinthians. And what we see in Paul's struggles in Romans and Corinthians is how it can possibly be that groups with radically different practices, radically different ideals, radically different social habits, and under the surface, as I think is clear enough in Corinthians, radically different social origins, how such groups can work towards a solidarity expressed in the common activity, the liturgy, the work of the people, that is Christian worship and sacramental worship. What comes together in and through this complex analysis and negotiation of diversity and tension, what comes together out of that is the act of identifying together as those who are corporately, generally, to be fed by their Maker and Redeemer in the Lord's Supper. So in the negotiation of conflict and tension, in the labor involved in that, which St. Paul sketches for us, again and again, we're brought back to at least two basic principles. One is the one articulated by Paul towards the end of his letter to the Romans. Your neighbor in the community is one who answers to the God you both worship, but her or his or their answer is not necessarily the same as yours. To his own master he stands or falls, says Paul bluntly. You are never going to be the judge of someone else's response to the God you both worship. And that enforces upon you. And enforces is a strong word, but I think needs to be used here. That enforces upon you a kind of appropriate hesitation in the presence of the other. The word hesitation I take from Simone Weil in her notebooks, where she speaks of the great sort of caution and respect and almost shyness with which we approach the mystery of the other, the threshold of the sanctuary of the other. We're not quite sure we should be there, and we can't push our way in. On the other hand, St. Paul underscores the principle that you should always be interrogating your own sense of what is self-evidently right to you. It's perfectly obvious that food sacrificed to idols means nothing because an idol is not a representation of anything. So why bother about dietary regulation. It's also perfectly obvious that food sacrificed to idols represents a corrupt and destructive habit which you must distance yourself from at the risk of compromising your own integrity and the integrity of your community. How do you cope with those two perfect obviousnesses? You cope, St. Paul suggests, by interrogating your own readiness, your own passion to be right, your own addiction to justification produced by your own actions. You make a number of pragmatic judgments about how far you can go in allowing the other to be themselves without compromising. You work, and presumably you also argue. Paul's picture of the Last Supper in Corinth is not exactly parish communion. One assumes a good deal of argument about a number of elements. But holding those arguments as arguments within a community is a matter of supposing that there is a level at which everyone has that exposure to need, dependence, or vulnerability, which makes it necessary, unavoidable, for us to depend upon one another, to be fed by one another, to be given life by one another. We do not make ourselves alive in the body of Christ, we receive, just as we do not teach ourselves to speak or to love, but need to be taught to receive what is given, to be formed in truth and in life. St. Paul pushes us to ask again and again, so what is it in my choices, in my lifestyle, that releases or confines the sharing of life? And that, you might say, is St. Paul's most fundamental moral principle. Is what I do a denial of life to the other, or an affirmation of life to the other? And the question, am I denying life to my neighbour, applies across the board in a range of activities, very much in Paul's context, those activities around food laws and table fellowship, but also involved in questions of personal and sexual morality. Many of the issues that Paul speaks about in terms of personal behavior are less a matter of whether someone is conforming to a given absolute, more a matter of whether certain kinds of behavior intrinsically block the sharing of life with the neighbor. So, if solidarity is conceived in terms both of shared labor and more deeply, as the goal of shared labor, the reality of shared life, we may perhaps begin to see how it moves away from the temptations of a communitarian turning inwards, a hasty and premature concern for a common good, which is not, at the end of the day, commonly defined, or a perilously sentimental and self-indulgent empathy. Solidarity as, to go back to the language I used earlier, solidarity as the removal of those obstacles to what is intrinsic to our humanity appears more clearly in terms of imperatives of action in this context. And it's, of course, no accident and no small thing that the context in which St. Paul most frequently and most eloquently discusses some of these issues is the Lord's Supper, the event of Holy Communion. Solidarity, for the theologian, is going to be ultimately a matter of what it means to live as a Eucharistic subject, as one who comes into common life conscious of hunger, but also in receiving what meets that hunger, conscious of the immediate inseparable imperative to feed in turn, to give life. So, in the light of all this, once again drawing together a few points which may again project us forward to next week's lectures. Bonhoeffer outlines in the Ethics a notion of nested, hierarchized human solidarities, which finally makes sense only within the kind of solidarity that the Christian community, the body of Christ, offers. If any of those become ends in themselves, they become blocks to the sharing of life. So that the Christian community sets up not a rival kind of solidarity to other forms of human togetherness. The Christian community exists in order to offer a framework of meaning or sense to any level of human togetherness, warning about the risks of turning inwards, the risk of premature resolution, the risk of refusing work, the risk of sentimentality, the risk of self-referentiality. Not a rival community. Bonhoeffer has some fascinating pages on how the church is not here to define its own territory in the world and defend it against others. The church as such has no territory. It does not claim part of the world as its field of operation, because it believes in a Christ who does not deal with part of humanity. But so far from that meaning that the church is a visibly hegemonic presence in all human society, dictating all the conditions of human interaction, the church steps back appropriately to offer its gift and its challenge of saying there is a deeper level at which communal solidarity and communal labor must be understood and must be effected. Needless to say, the challenge this poses to the way the church itself works is rather formidable. And if you find it difficult to recognize the church as you know and love in this description I've just outlined, you are not alone. Yet the church, in its practice and its language, continues to imagine a solidarity of that kind. Because the imagining of the baptized community, the imagining of the Eucharistic community, cannot be less than universal in the sense earlier outlined. Cannot be less than universal without subverting its own logic. This, of course, was the conceptual crisis provoking the creation of the Confessing Church, the Barmen Declaration in 1930s Germany, for all of the signal moral and historical failures of the Barmen Declaration and the Confessing Church in addressing the worst and most toxic form of tribalism in Germany at that time, that is anti-Semitism. For all that, there was a recognition that the church could not simply accept a model of solidarity in which certain human beings were preemptively declared incapable of sharing, unworthy of having life given to them. So the logic of what we say and the logic of what we do as a Christian community pushes us towards that vision of active, laboring solidarity in a way which properly makes the church an uneasy, conflicted, and penitent body. Tempting as it is for some of us, especially for superannuated archbishops, to think how much nicer it would be if the church were less riven by conflict. There is something about the conflicted nature of our Christian identity, built into the idea that we have never quite arrived at the solidarity to which we are called. We are never quite able, in any generation, in any part of the church, to realize what it is we are most profoundly summoned to. And to acknowledge that with honesty and with penitence and without panic is part of the imperative to solidarity. It is worth taking conflict seriously. That is not denying it, not sidelining it, not simplifying it. It is worth taking it seriously because it is worth working for that universal, radical mutuality, that deep recognition of the otherness of the other in common life that the imagery and the reality of the body of Christ puts before us. So, having said a few words about the critiques of solidarity that have arisen, especially in the last half century, the very proper challenges placed to easy forms of solidarity and sentimental forms of solidarity, we are beginning to think towards what a universal mutuality, a universal shared good might be. And we're on the verge of looking towards how that imagery, that ideal, that imagined community that is the body of Christ works against, again, resists the constant push to varieties of tribalism in our world. In the third of these lectures, I want to turn to the realities of tribalism as it recurs and reinvents itself in our moral and social and international world. I'm to look at what it is that, in various ways, works against that resurgent and persistent tribalism. I'm to touch a little bit on the realities of tribalism within the church and what it is that, as I say, projects us beyond that. And in the fourth and final lecture, I'll come to a wider consideration of how the kind of perspective I've been outlining has certain things to say about the contested language around human rights and human dignity, whether this language allows us some fresh thinking about the nature of human rights, a more contested concept now than when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drawn up, and how all of that finally relates to the most basic insight, the most basic question of all, the role in Christian ethics, spirituality, and theology of our belief that human beings are made in the divine image. So those are the subjects I hope to return to next week. And once again, thank you for your forbearance and your patient listening.